And she just looked at me and smiled and said, yes, many authors would like that. I said, yeah, but can we do maybe a little sample translation? She said, no, it's a waste of money. I have a limited budget and I'm not going to waste it on your book. Okay. But I had lived in America for 8 years and I wrote the book in America, and I figured somehow I had the sense it belongs here. I really would like this book to be published here. And I flew to New York and I called up all the editors and said, you know, I'm an author, debut novelist from Germany, and I have this wonderful love story. It's between a blind boy and a crippled girl set in Burma. Exactly. I said, yeah, sounds intriguing. Why don't you leave it at the front desk? We get back to you. I left 20 hardcover books at the front desk and nobody ever got back to me. So I figured, okay, I need a translation. I need an English translation. And I called up all the famous translators, and nobody wanted to take me on. I said, well, I pay the full amount, whatever, but they all thought this is probably a waste of money because this book, which didn't even sell well in Germany, will never come out in America. And one woman I called so often that she felt pity, and she said, I have this very nice student, he wants to be a translator, give him a chance. His name is Kevin. So he does a sample translation, 30 pages, and if you like it, you know, you'll commission the translation. He sent me the first 30 pages. I read them, and then I had to look up the original because I could not believe that I can write that well. This is really good. I write it. He did the job, fantastic, I love it, and now I had a translation. And again, I flew to New York, and now I knew I need an agent. In America, you are nothing without an agent. I called up all the famous agencies, and the same happened again. I love story, oh, interesting. Leave it at the front desk. And I left 20 English translations at 20 different front desks. Nobody ever got back to me. And then in the end, I figured, you know, I'm a daydreamer. That's what I do. That's how I make a living. I dream and I write it down. And this was my dream, but I thought, you know, what else can I do? I don't have an agent. The big houses either didn't read it or rejected me. So I remember I had dinner with my wife Anna, and I said to her, Anna, maybe I should be a grown-up now. There are dreams in life that don't come true, and maybe this is one of them. My book will never be published in America. And a friend of mine, he had come back from Boston. He had met Judith Gurvich, the publisher of Other Press. It's a small house, and he said, you know, they do translations. Why don't you send it to her? So I sent it to Judith Gurvich by email. 2 weeks later, I remember, it was a Sunday morning, I got a reply regarding The Art of Hearing Heartbeats, Judith Gurvich, and I had read rejection letters, and I knew it, you know, didn't know. I read it again, and I read it for the third time, and then I woke up my wife. Because she said, I read your book, I love it, and we will do it. And then 3 years ago, The Art of Hearing Heartbeats came out, and it's a small house. She said, usually I sell about 2,000, 3,000 copies per book. If we sell 5,000 of your book, I will be so thrilled. And now you come in as my readers, as the booksellers, and I think it's wonderful to know that even today with Amazon and the internet, that you as a reader can make a book. You love it, you recommend it, you buy it, you give it to friends, booksellers hand sell it, recommend it. I wasn't on ABC, I wasn't on America Morning Show, whatever, there were no reviews.
Oprah?
Oprah, no support from that side, the media, no. Just because of you. You read the book, you love it, you recommend it. We have sold just The Art of Hearing Heartbeats more than 350,000 copies. Thank you. And then The Well-Tempered Art came out. And now I'm here, and now you know why this is a little miracle and why it took me 10 years to get here. I'm here, and I'm really thrilled that I can introduce a new series. Whispering Shadows is the first of a trilogy, and it's a very different book. I don't know if any of you have read it, but it came out in America 2.5 weeks ago, and it's different. And I wrote it actually after The Art of Hearing Heartbeats, and I think I wanted to do something different. And the way I work, I have to explain to you. I don't plan a book. It's not like that I have the story and then I know what's going to happen in chapter 15 and 25 and 5. I need just a starting point. And I call it my emotional hook. I need a character I can, on a very deep emotional level, I can connect with. And I'm not my own autobiographer. I don't think why. I just see there's this connection. And with Tin Win, I had this very deep connection for whatever reason. This very lonely boy, abandoned by his parents, father died, mother abandoned him, brought up by a neighbor, turning blind. I mean, he was in such a misery, and I could connect with him. And I was wondering, is there a force in life that can pull you out of this misery? And that was the starting point of the Uttering Heartbeats, basically. And it was a journey, an exploration. Is there something? And the same with A Well-Tempered Heart later on. There my connection was with Tata, a Burmese character who also had a terrible childhood and had a lot to forgive. And then it was with Julia, this woman from the West in her 30s, very successful, from the outside, happy woman, but something was missing in her life. And she started a search for meaning in life. And this was a level I could connect with. With Paul, it was different. He came to me, and I don't know how, and I don't know why. I just met him on an emotional level, Paul Leibowitz. He's the main character of Whispering Shadows. And sometimes people ask me, are you Paul? Because there are similarities. Paul is in his 50s, like I am. He used to be a journalist, like I was. He lives in Hong Kong. I used to live in Hong Kong. He loves Hong Kong. I do love Hong Kong. He lives on a small island where I used to live, but that's where it stops. Paul is good looking. He has curly long hair, and we are different, but we connect on a very deep emotional level. And he has suffered a terrible tragedy. He was a successful journalist, business consultant at one point, had a child rather late in his 40s, and he became a very devout father. His son Justin was everything for him, and his wife was making a career as a banker, and he took care of Justin, and then Justin gets sick and dies of cancer. And I tell you, the first few pages of Whispering Shadows, it's a tough read, especially when you have children. And for me, in hindsight, I didn't know it at that point, but I just had a child at that time when I started writing. And I think for me, when you have children, the worst fear is that you might lose one, car accident, whatever, disease. And I think that was my way of dealing with that fear. Not on a conscious level, but on an unconscious level, that I just worked through this fantasy, this incredible fear that I might lose my child. So that's what happens to Paul, and he kind of withdraws from the world. His marriage falls apart, and for him, the only thing that's left of Justin are memories. And as we all know, memories tend to fade away, and he thinks, the more he participates in life, the more he creates new memories, the faster the old memories of Justin will fade away. So for him, the perfect day, the perfect week is a week where he doesn't talk to anybody. He has his routine in his house every day. He does the same, walk, exercise, does the shopping, the cooking. So he's very lonely. But then he meets a woman, and on a rainy day, and they kind of start a difficult relationship. And again, maybe it's a similar question: is there a force which can pull you back into life after such a loss? And the tone is different. It's set in China. It's a very different place than Burma. There's kind of a murder mystery involved. And I had thought I wrote something very different. And now the book is out, and readers remind me, I get letters and emails that even though the tone and the setting is different from the Heartbeat series, the author of The Uttering Heartbeats shines through on almost every page. And I think it must be the humanity, the intensity of the emotions, which is just the way who I am and the way I write. So even though I thought I write something different, it is different, and I think it's very similar at the same time. The setting is China, and I can't say I fell in love with China like I did with Burma, because China is a very tough place. I don't know who has been there. It is cruel, it is tough, but it's also absolutely fascinating. So I would say I'm fascinated by China, and that's why the setting. It's not just a background. China, its recent history is really part of the book, part of the story. And I used to cover it. I used to travel in China, and I would like, instead of reading, I will read 2 very short paragraphs today, or pages, because usually I prefer you reading my book yourself instead of me reading it to you. So I will tell you a few anecdotes and there you will see how they inspire my writing, my research, my travels, me meeting people, meeting Chinese people. And when I worked there as a journalist, I decided to be based in Hong Kong. I had the choice being based in Beijing, but that has a disadvantage. You are there as a journalist, and whenever you want to do a story, you have to have the permission of the Foreign State Department, and then they send somebody with you, and then you travel to a city, and then the party secretary joins you, and you travel to a small village, and then the party secretary joins you, and then you interview a farmer, and you have 3 officials with you. This is basically senseless because they won't tell you anything. Mm-hmm. So I was based in Hong Kong, and I could travel freely in China. Wow. I got a visa for 6 months, got it renewed every 6 months, and I could travel in and out as often as I want. I could stay there for 30 days. I tried to learn Chinese. I failed completely. It's such a difficult language. You have these sh 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 sounds, and I tried, and I didn't even hear a difference. So on my first trip, I met a wonderful woman, a journalist, a Chinese journalist from Beijing, and Changdan, and I've been traveling with her for 20 years. All my Stern stories, all my book research I do with Changdan. She speaks English very well, and she's a great translator because she also translates not just the language, but also the culture. Mm-hmm. Very often people told me stories and I just didn't get it. Why would they answer my question in that way? And later on in the hotel, Changdan would tell me what's the background here. So we travel together and we come somewhere, and I always introduce myself. I say, Wo di min tse chao ling ling chi. Okay, nobody speaks Chinese. That means my name is 007. And it always works. I like an icebreaker, and even in the most remote village, somebody says, "Oh, Bond, Mr. Bond." So I traveled a lot, did all kinds of stories, and as I said, China and current day China, the recent past, is a big, big part of Whispering Shadows. And when you hear my stories later on, you might want to ask me a question. I'm being asked that a lot. Do you really like China? And when I'm asked that, I realize that this is actually not something I ask myself, because I'm not there to like or dislike China. I'm there to understand. And often it's a very strange place. I'm surprised on every trip. Remember, a while ago I was in Shanghai, and I was interviewing 2 very nice ladies in their 30s. Beautiful, successful, and they had one problem. They were single. And how come you're single? That's, we're already 35 and 37, but we are too rich, we are too successful, and Chinese men have problems with the successful women, obviously. And I said, but you are you speak English well, and you're educated, you're successful. Maybe you haven't found the right one. We have to put out a personal ad. I know my way with words. You tell me what you look for, and I put it in nice words, and then we put it out somewhere. And they were thinking, I said, what is the most important thing you look? What would you like to know about your future husband? Your first, most important question. They were thinking. Then they both said, what kind of relationship he has with his parents. Mm. And I thought this is probably one of the least things that would come to mind to a German or American woman. Why is that important? Oh, they said this is the most important thing, because if we know what kind of relationship he has with his parents, we will know how he will treat us later. Mm-hmm. So, wow, smart thinking there. I learned something. But very often it's more dramatic, and sometimes I'm appalled by what I see, and then I really have to hold back, not to judge, and not to get angry, or not to say this is this is disgusting. And I would like to tell you 2 little stories, and for me this is one of the things that really appall me in China. It's the disparity, the inequality, the rich people and the poor people. And the rich people, they show it in a way. Whispering Shadows is set in Hong Kong and in Shenzhen, which is bordering Hong Kong, and it's also a little bit, since it's a murder mystery, in the red light district. And I wanted to interview a prostitute. Wanted to know, what's her background, why did she become one, and wanted to include that in the book. And I didn't want Changdan to be around, honestly, so when I interview a prostitute. I asked a friend, where could I meet one who speaks a little English? And he said, oh, that's not difficult. You go to a certain bar and go early at 7 o'clock. There's a long counter, and there will be at least 20 young, beautiful women sitting there. They will all look at you, you go to a table, you order a drink, and within a minute or two, somebody will join you, probably the one who speaks a little English. I did, as I was told. And absolutely, bar, 7 o'clock, 20 young girls sitting there. I went to a table, ordered a Heineken, and nothing happened. And I tell you, that's embarrassing. Okay, I ordered a second Heineken, and nothing happened. But then, slowly, Chinese men came in, like in their 30s, all very nicely dressed, Armani suits, whatever. And they ordered drinks, a bottle of champagne, cognac, whiskey. And after half an hour, the counter was empty and all the tables were busy with Chinese men and these prostitutes. I said, oh wow, I can do that. So no problem. If that's the thing. I ordered a bottle of champagne, so I got the menu to see which one I would like to order. The cheapest one was about $1,000 US. Bottle of cognac XO, 2,000.
Oh.
I ordered a third Heineken. Okay, but I stayed and I just observed. It was interesting for a writer, and I did the math, calculated what they consumed, and on every table they spent between $5,000 and $8,000 US that night.
Oh.
In a country where at that time the average annual income was $1,500. Can you believe the tensions in that kind, in that society? And a few days later I went to Macau, and I went to a casino, to a VIP room, and there was a table, they were playing Baccarat. And the guys, it wasn't like very VIP, it was all dirty, the floors and even the table. But they had these stacks in front of them, they were playing. And I saw what they were worth, and then I again did the math. So all these players had between $250,000 and $500,000 in front of them, and were gambling. And I thought, wow, this is fascinating. I walked around because I wanted to see how the face of a guy looks like when he loses $250,000 or wins. Fascinating. No, it was very disappointing because it looked exactly the same. Couldn't see any emotions. And these people, they looked more like construction workers. They had T-shirts and they were cleaning their teeth with toothpicks, and then they flipped these toothpicks behind them. And there was one woman, she was the cleaning lady. Her only job was to pick up these dirty toothpicks. And I wanted to talk to her, but she didn't speak much English, only a little bit. And she told me that her monthly income was $20. And there were these guys gambling, $250,000, $500,000. And those are the moments where I am appalled, where I think this is so unjust, this is so, but I try to, hold back and not to judge, but to understand how this country works. And I'm very often told when I do my readings, because China is becoming so powerful nowadays, do we have to be afraid of China because politically, economically it's so powerful? And I always say, no, we don't have to be afraid of China, we have to be afraid for China. Because for me, this can't go on. This is all built on a lie, and somehow there will be a major crisis, maybe next week, maybe in 10 years, nobody knows. But this society won't last this way. And I think you will understand a little better after a few more stories, give you an impression. There are I would like to introduce you to 3 different people, and they all inspired my writing. And I will read a short passage soon, because it's about food. It's about change and food. It's funny, with the Chinese, when they meet each other, they don't say, how are you? They say, have you eaten yet? And I have had fantastic dinners and lunches in restaurants and at home. And I would like to introduce you to a friend of mine, Miss Lee. Miss Lee I met many years ago, I think 96, for the first time in Shenyang. That's further north, and I was a correspondent, and I was supposed to do a story about unemployed Chinese. And in those days it was even officially a very communist country, and I thought, how can you be unemployed in a communist country? But they had these huge state-owned enterprises. They employ like 500,000 people, and they weren't making any money, so they had to lay off people. And Shenyang was especially hard hit, and I went there with Changdan, and we walked around the train station, and I noticed a woman, a short woman, kind of roundish, red cheeks, smiling, And she had a very little table, half the size, short table, and she was selling snacks and drinks. And she was also a public phone, because she was in front of a camera equipment store that was a state-owned enterprise, and they had a phone. Those days nobody had a phone, of course, no handy, no mobile. So she rented the phone from the state-owned enterprise and, had it out on the sidewalk and was renting out the phone to passers-by. And so I was thirsty, I bought a drink and we started chatting. And she was so nice and she had such a gentle way of, telling her stories. I stayed for a while. Then I stayed for a whole week in Shenyang, and every day I went back and had a drink and we chatted, and in the end she invited me to her home and she told me her story. And this story is about change. When she was 13, she had lost her mother. She had a little sister and her father was totally overwhelmed by the situation. And the people who took care of her and her sister was the party secretary and his wife. And she told me she has always wanted to become a member of the Communist Party of China. That was her dream. So when she was 18, she approached the party secretary and said, I would like to be a member of the Communist Party. He said, oh no, you have to be. We have to wait. This is a big honor. You have to prove that you would be a worthwhile member. Work hard and we will see. So she became a baker in a state-owned enterprise in a bakery and hotel. Worked very hard, and at the age of 22, the party secretary came and said, you will be accepted. You will be a member of the Communist Party of China. And she told me that was one of the happiest days in her life. Then she wanted to get married. This is a very typical story for her age. She wanted to get married, and again she went to the party secretary and said, can you choose a husband for me? I want a real one, not a student, not an intellectual, but a worker. So he found a worker for her, working at an assembly line in a tire factory. They got married, they had a daughter, but she was ambitious. In America, we would call her like a career woman. She wanted to make a career. Her new goal was to be a model worker. Her husband took care of the daughter, and she worked very hard. In the morning, the first one in the evening, the last one out. Eventually, the party secretary came and said, you will be Shenyang's next model worker. And when we had dinner at her home, the first thing she did, she took me, when we went at the apartment, she took me by the hands, showed me her bedroom, and there was a framed picture of her, the party secretary. She had a bunch of flowers, smiling very proudly, and she had a bike. That was the award she got for being a role model worker. So again, a very happy day in her life. She worked hard, and one day, now it's 93, 94, her boss called her in to his office and said, Ms. Lee, we don't need you anymore. She said, oh great, I can go home early today. No, you misunderstood. You are fired. And for her that was a catastrophe, because in China your Danwei, your work unit, was even more important than your husband. Your husband could divorce you, your work unit not. They would take care of you until you die, take care of your kids, pay your pension, your health care, everything. And now the work unit said, we don't need you anymore. That was unthinkable. She went home, and later I talked to her daughter, and she said, I think my mom had kind of a nervous breakdown. She didn't leave the apartment for a year. Most of the time she stayed in her bedroom. But the family needed money. Her husband said, you have to look for a job, you need money. But as a baker, early 40s, a woman in China, that was difficult. She couldn't find a job. Eventually her daughter said, Mommy, then you have to be an entrepreneur. Oh, that was absolutely unthinkable. And that's bourgeois, that's the class enemy. During the Cultural Revolution, she cursed these people. She would never become self-employed entrepreneur. But after another year, no job, she opened up her little stall, the one I described to you. And when I met her, she had been doing that for 2 years, and they had invited us to her home, and I saw, wow, the family, they were doing well. They had a fridge, they had a color TV, they had a digital camera, and all because of her job. Because her husband was still working in this factory, and he was making 300 RMB per month. That's about $30. She was making 5,000 as a private entrepreneur. And she said, what's even more important than the money, I learned to stand on my own feet. So I left, and a year later I went back, and my first goal was to meet her, but she was gone. I walked to that place and, oh, maybe she went bankrupt. I don't know what happened to my private entrepreneur. But what's also gone was the state-owned enterprise behind her, this camera equipment store. And there was a huge neon sign now. Shenyang's model worker is there for you 24 hours a day. The little private entrepreneur had taken over the state-owned enterprise. That one went bankrupt and she went, and it was a small store, like half the size of this corner here. It was winter, the heating didn't work. It was so cold that the warm drinks came out of the fridge. And, but she was so happy to see me. She was wearing 3 coats and she called her husband, Jan-Philipp is in town, and they invited me for dinner. In the evening we went and he was a great cook. Oh, I loved it, and I will read it to you soon. He cooked it, smelled delicious, the food was delicious, we had lots of drinks, chatting, talking. And then the door opened and their daughter came in, and she came from work. She had a model agency. And in those days it was a very popular evening entertainment that, the guys go out for dinner and young girls wearing just swimsuits and bikinis, they walk along the aisles and the guys were watching them. She did that for a few months, hated it. But, somebody has to organize that. So she founded her own model agency, had 5 girls working for her, and she made 10,000 RMB per month.
Wow.
Her father, having worked at this factory for 40 years, made 300. Does that make any sense? No. So I asked him, at one point, you must be angry. You must be jealous. How come you still make 300 and your daughter makes 10,000 with this kind of job? Are you angry? And he thought about it. He was a heavy smoker, smoked. Said, no, I'm not angry. My generation, we dreamed of sacrificing our lives for the good of the country, and you see what happened to China. My daughter's generation, they think of themselves first, and in the end, the country will benefit as well. I don't know if he's right, only history will tell, but at least that's the way I think his generation looks at it now, so that they don't get angry or jealous or envious. And I would like, as I said, I would like to read one short 2 pages, because as I said, it's about cooking, and since food is so important, when I wrote this, it's a funny thing, I wrote the scene, and afterwards I got so hungry, I had such longing for Chinese food that I went out and had Chinese lunch. The only friend Paul Leibowitz, the main character, had in his life is Cheng. He is a homicide detective in Shenzhen, and Paul visits Cheng and his wife Mai, and Cheng is a passionate cook. So this is the scene that they sit in the small kitchen like I just described. I had experienced with Miss Lee, folding chairs, folding tables. Cheng diced the eggplant with deft movements, put it in a bowl and sprinkled salt on it. He took a smaller knife and chopped fresh ginger and garlic into tiny pieces, sliced 2 bunches of spring onions, cut the tofu into small pieces, and fetched several jars containing pickled chili, chili paste, and fermented black beans from the cupboard. He was dry frying some Sichuan peppercorns in a pan on the side. Once they were done, he ground them to a fine powder in a mortar with slow, rhythmic strokes of the pestle. Paul set out a folding table and 3 stools in a corner of the tiny kitchen, sat down, and watched Cheng's every movement. Cheng barely spoke in the kitchen. He did not reply to any questions. He didn't even hear them. Guests who arrived didn't get a look from him. He was deep in a world of smells and spices, of herbs, oils and pastes, of steaming, slicing and woks. His wife and Paul thought that cooking was another form of meditation for him, and he had let them believe this for over 20 years. There were things in his life that he could not talk about, not even more than 30 years later, neither with his best friend nor with his wife. How could they understand that food was never just a simple meal for him? That he envied everyone for whom it was so simple? That he could never put a piece of tofu, chicken's foot, no, not even a single tiny grain of rice into his mouth without thinking of Li, Wu, Hong, and all the others in his work brigade who, like him, had been sent into the countryside as children during the Cultural Revolution to help the farmers with the harvest. They had been forced to labor for 6 long, God-forsaken years. 6 years in which they thought they had been forgotten by their parents and by the rest of the world. 6 years in which not one summer or winter passed without one, weakened by starvation, died. 6 years in which they could think about nothing for days at a time but the dumplings his mother used to make. Not about his mother. Chang thought about the dumplings. For him, every meal was a celebration, a small, quiet triumph of life over death, of love over hate, of beauty over ugliness, of good over evil. And the more effort he made, the better it tasted. The more the taste buds were stimulated or the nose pleasured, the more stomach was filled, the sweeter the triumph was. Who said a pinch of pepper was just a matter of taste? Who said coriander, chili, ginger, and salt were only spices? Who said life was so simple? He had seen how the Red Guards had shouted at old Hu just because he had tried to give his watery broth a little taste with some of the pepper he had secretly stored away. The peppercorns were said to be proof of his decadent bourgeois past and of the impossibility of reforming him. The soup had to taste the same for everyone. Who did he think he was? He had better not dare think of trying that again. And what did the mad old fellow do? What did this fool who had worked as a chef in a French restaurant in Shanghai before the revolution do? He seasoned his food. He seasoned it again, he seasoned it without showing any remorse. As though pepper were a form of resistance against barbarism. The Red Guards had been watching him. They beat him until he no longer moved. The whole village watched. The children, the old people, the men, the women, and no one helped him. Instead, they screamed, "Punish the counter-revolutionary Hu! No mercy for Hu's betrayal!" And the 16-year-old Chang stood there and screamed with them. And if they had ordered him to hit him, he would have done it. 3 peppercorns. Who was he supposed to explain that to? Beaten to death because of 3 lousy black peppercorns. Who on earth would ever understand that? Yeah, there are stories like that in the book, and some I made up, but many were just told to me. And this is really, it was an amazing experience. We think Chinese are guarded and we can read their faces, whatever, they don't show emotions. So many Chinese broke down in tears in front of me. Maybe because I was the first one who asked them. And they actually taught me how important the past in China is. And you go to China and you're overwhelmed. I don't know who has been there, but you go to Shanghai, the high-rise buildings, the new airport, the energy in the city. In 1979, there were 15 high-rise buildings in Shanghai. The tallest was like 20 floors. Now there are 4,500 high-rise buildings. I mean, the past, the change, it's so incredible. And you think, wow, this is the 21st century. But then you look behind the facade, and I was lucky, I was blessed that I could do that. And you see, this is just the facade. Behind it, it looks very different. There's the past, and it's very much alive because people are not allowed to talk about it. It's taboo. They're not allowed to write about it, to read about it. And I would like to tell you one little example. Another friend of mine, Han Feng, and if she were here with me, you wouldn't look at me, you would look at her. She's a short, very, very beautiful woman, extremely well dressed, in her early 50s, and she speaks English very well, full of self-esteem, very strong, very forceful, exactly like China would like to portray itself to the world. She's a great example. When we drive through Shanghai, she's a lawyer, we drive in a Mercedes 500, and she listens to Beethoven and Brahms and Mozart, very cultivated. But she said to me, inside me it looks very different. And she told me her story, that when she was young, a little girl, 5, 6 years old, her father was a high-ranking party member, but then the Cultural Revolution started and he fell from grace, he was sent to the countryside. And nobody explained why to Han Feng. She thought maybe he had another family, he had kids he loved more than her, so she was only to see him once a year. But she had kind of a surrogate father in the neighborhood, a very nice man, and she talked about the whole evening. We had dinner, she talked about him, what he meant to her. She said they played this game. I don't know if you played in America. We played in Germany actually. Come in meine Arme, come in my arms. You know, you have a little kid and you go on your knees and you open your arms and the kid runs into your arms and you lift it up and turn around and say, my darling, And he did that with her every time they saw each other. And then he started to teach her calligraphy and the first math things. So they were very, very close. But one day, he disappeared as well. And then 3 months later, he showed up again. And she told me how she saw him. He looked very beaten down, very dirty. He used to be a teacher. Now his job was cleaning the public toilet. And he got on his knees, but Anfang was with her mom and some neighbors. And she sensed this would not be the appropriate thing to run into his arms, because her mom, who knew him, didn't even greet him. So she didn't. And this happened over and over again the next few weeks. He saw her, got on his knees, he wanted, but she didn't move. She didn't even smile, nothing. And then 4 months later, he completely disappeared, and only later she learned that he was beaten to death by the Red Guards. And she said, there are days, even though I look so strong and so successful, full of self-esteem, she said, there are days I don't dare to go out. I don't even dare to look into the mirror because I feel so weak and I feel so ashamed of myself that I betrayed him in such a way. And even though she was in her 40s, this was more than 40 years ago, 50s, more than 40 years ago, and she still couldn't overcome it. And this is kind of a story I've heard over and over again. People who had betrayed their parents, and they broke down because for the first time they didn't tell their kids, they didn't tell their grandparents. They told me how they betrayed their parents, and some even were responsible for years in labor camps. Their parents were sent to labor camps because they had betrayed them. So those are stories. They all inspire my writing, and they all get into the book. And I was there at one last important issue, past, but it's also maybe the most important issue today for me in China is trust. Coming from the West, I take it for granted. I can trust the police in Germany. I trust the judiciary system. I trust that our elections are free and fair. There are some, public figures who have some moral authority. And one question I've asked all the Chinese I've met over the last 20 years, and there were hundreds, whom do you trust? I haven't met a single Chinese who could name one institution or one person they would trust. How do you want to build a society without any trust? I was there in December doing research for the third book of the trilogy, and spent 3 weeks, interviewed, talked to people, mostly well-off people, middle class, upper middle class. I didn't meet a single person who didn't want to get out. At least get a foreign passport as kind of a safety net in case things go wrong in China. And there was one man, he was in his 60s, very rich, successful entrepreneur. We were talking, he invited me to a very expensive French restaurant. And all of a sudden he said, I would like to immigrate to Germany. Is that difficult? Why would you like to immigrate to Germany? This is the country of opportunities, I'm told. He said, yeah, I'm rich, I don't need that. But my problem is I have a disabled child. I have an autistic son who is in his late 20s, and I don't know who will take care of him when I and my wife, when we die. I have enough money to pay for 24-hour care, 10 people for the rest of his life, but I don't have anybody to trust. Doesn't he have a sibling? No, he's my only child, but even if we had another child, it wouldn't make any difference because I wouldn't trust that child either. They might get married or whatever, and then, who knows what happens. So, can I immigrate to Germany? And yet Germany, Switzerland, Australia, and New Zealand were his countries of choice. So, it's not that easy. I said, I give myself 5 years. And then, after 5 years, I will have to kill him.
What?
I would have to kill him because he said I wouldn't leave my son without me or my wife because there's nobody I could trust to really take care of him. So I thought this is again a very, very telling story about the state of that country. Last thing I would like to do to end this on a lighter note, I read a passage about Paul, my main character, and Tang. Victor Tang is the business partner of American a business family, and their son gets killed in China, and Tang is their partner, and Paul, meets him for the first time. Paul is trying to crack this murder case with his friend Cheng, and Paul and Tang are very suspicious of each other. They really don't know. Paul thinks Tang might be involved, and Tang doesn't know why Paul is investigating. So they meet for the first time in Tang's house, a very rich man. And the funny thing is, I wrote this scene here. When I started writing, I didn't know what they would talk about. I wrote it so that they would meet, that they have dinner together, and then they sat at the dinner table, said, and now what? And it's funny. This scene, what you hear now, just came to me. I don't know where it came from. And usually I edit a lot. I re-edit and re-edit. And here, I just wrote it down and I didn't add anything. So, I don't know why. So it's all made up. And as I said, Tang and Paul, they sit down and they sip their champagne and were silent for a moment. The Owens, the American business family, the Owens told me how helpful you were to them in Hong Kong, Mr. Leibowitz. I want to thank you for that. But I know very little about you. I don't even know what you do in Hong Kong. Paul thought for an instant. He had told the Owens almost nothing about himself, so Tang really could hardly know anything about him. I manage 2 China investment funds, Hutch and Go Global, he said. How interesting. What kind of investments? Venture capital for Chinese startups. Which industries? Various industries. We are very diversified. Any specialties? Yes, lie detectors. I'm sorry? We are financing the development of a completely new type of lie detector, which a Chinese company in Shenyang is working on. Paul could see clearly from Victor Tang's otherwise poised expression that he was disconcerted by this. He had often experienced that in conversation with Chinese people. Many of them found it as difficult to guess his age as to understand his sense of humor. They knew exactly what he was. They never knew exactly when he was joking and when he was being serious. And Victor Tang also had this problem. He stared at Paul, nodding uncertainly. We have invested a lot of money in a joint venture, the Truth and Trust Worldwide Cooperation, TTWW for short. Paul continued in a serious tone. He had to muster all of his self-control to suppress a smile. He could guess what would happen next. Tang would not admit that he was unnerved. If Paul was having him on, it would be the same as losing face. So he would have to find out the truth in the course of the conversation. Lie detectors? Tang asked, if he had misheard. Yes, lie detectors, Paul said. But they already exist. What's new about your machine? A revolutionary technology. We don't measure the electrical currents in the brain, but the heart rate. The heart reacts to a lie much more quickly than the brain. The heart? Yes, you can't fool the heart. It's amazing. I wouldn't have believed it before, but our tests prove it. The method is absolutely reliable. The machine will be small and portable, not too expensive, and easy to operate. The first domestic lie detector, so to speak. For use at home? Tang's voice sounded more and more perplexed. Of course, not just for the home. It will work on a wireless basis up to a distance of 20 meters. So you can use it in the office, or at presentations, or press conferences, without wiring anyone up to it. We think there will be a big market for it, especially in these times, don't you think so? I don't know. Which markets do you have in mind? China, Europe, America, everywhere lies are told. Tang said nothing and gave him a considered look. It was not a look intended to intimidate. He had a questioning, searching expression on his face, and Paul was surprised to realize that this man was not as unlikable as he had thought he would be. How would he react now? Admit that he did not know what was going on? Paul was eager to hear his reply. Advantage Leibowitz, Tang finally said. I like you. I still can't tell if you're kidding or not. Instead of saying anything right away, Paul allowed himself a grin that spread right across his face for a second. We are still looking, he said, again perfectly seriously, for a suitable name for the product. What do you think about I lie? Thank you. So you got a slight idea about the book, what inspired me writing it, and if you have some questions, I'm happy to try to answer them about this book, about the other, about writing.
Do you still work as a journalist or?
No,
No.
I quit 10 years ago, basically,
Okay.
because it had always been my dream to write novels.
Uh-huh.
And I tried The Art of Hearing Heartbeats. It didn't really work out that well at the beginning. Now it's been doing very well. At the beginning it didn't, but I didn't like working as a journalist anymore, so I quit. And now I'm a full-time novelist.
Great.
Yeah.
And do you write in German
I write in German.
exclusively?
Yeah.
And so you've already written 2 of these?
I've written 4 novels, the 2 Burma books, and then this one and Dragon Games, which will come out next year in America. And I'm currently writing the 3rd book in this trilogy.
And this Jang feature and all of them?
Yeah. Yes?
The expression is you can't tell a book by the cover. I thought the covers were art pieces were so inviting since I wasn't familiar with your work. How did you choose the art for the covers?
Well, luckily that's not my job. That's a publisher, and I agree with you. I think The Art of Hearing Heartbeats, it has been out in more than 30 countries, so and they all sent me copies, so I really have 30 different covers, and this is my favorite. I love the way they designed it. And I think Well-Tempered Art also, it's a little too dark for my taste, but I also like it. And this one here has an interesting story. They had a different cover. You can find it online somewhere. But then actually the publisher of Simon & Schuster, she saw the other cover and said, no, I love this book, she read it, and this deserves a better cover, and they came up with this one, and I also like this very much. I think it's a beautiful design and kind of mysterious. But they show it to me. I have kind of a veto power, but I can't tell them what to do, just if I say, no, I hate this.
It's wonderful, though.
Thank you. Yeah.
So how did you get so into the heart, whether it's a well-tempered heart or you talk about a heart in this piece? It sounds like this is very much a part of who you are, and how did you tap into that?
I don't know. I don't know. You're right. That's who I am, I guess, and it's dear to my heart. It's a nice metaphor for things, and I can tell you how The Art of Hearing Heartbeats, how it all started with a heartbeat. First of all, one of the most magical moments of my life was when my wife was pregnant in the delivery room, and then they put this thing on the belly, and you hear the heartbeat of the unborn child. That was like listening to God or whatever. I mean, this was for me so special. And then when my son Jonathan was like 2.5, we played catch on a lawn in upstate New York where we live, and afterwards he put his head on my chest, and I was out of breath, and he said, "Oh, Daddy, I hear a noise in your chest." How does it sound? Boom, 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 boom. That's my heart you're hearing. Oh, and he loved that. And the next morning he came into our bed snuggling, and again he put his head on my chest and said, "Your heart sounds different today, Daddy." And I'm a little anxious when it comes to my heartbeat. So, what do you mean? And it makes boom, boom, boom. Yeah, because I'm rested. I just woke up, so my heart sounds different. And it became one of his favorite games for a while, listening to Daddy's heartbeat. And I thought, wow, how if somebody could hear heartbeats from afar? Probably all our hearts sound different, like our voices. We just can't pick it up.
Yeah.
Maybe they sound different, not just when we're out of breath, but like our voices when we are depressed or happy or angry. So that's the idea with the heartbeat started, and The Art of Hearing Heartbeats.
That's great.
That's beautiful.
I have a question. I loved your first book,
Mhm.
and I'm reading the second one now.
Mhm.
But did you ever read Colors of the Mountain?
No.
It's written by a Chinese gentleman,
Colors of the Mountain. Mhm.
and he lived through the revolution in
Mhm.
China, and it's one of our first book club
Oh,
books,
okay.
and it was very interesting.
I'll
To
check
me-
that out. Thank you.
Yeah, I can't
Yeah.
remember the author.
Yeah, that was easy to find.
Colors of the Mountain.
Thank you. You had a good-
Yes, there's a lot of poverty and a lot of wealth in this book.
Mhm.
And the shock that you experienced when you visited and saw the wealth that was spent in the bar. And then a lot of the characters are quite poor.
Mhm.
Did you find in your own experience or in your research the percentage of wealth versus poverty in this particular country? And how does that react? How do you react to that?
Yeah, as I said, sometimes it makes me very angry because I have not just been to fancy restaurants, but very often to very, very poor villages set in poor.
Would you say most of the people are poor and very few are rich?
Yes, still. I mean, the average annual income is still, I think, $2,000.
And where does the most of that money come from, the wealth?
The wealth.
The wealth.
Look at your shoes. Look at your TV set. Look
Just
at the chairs.
manufacturing?
I mean, manufacturing. It's a factory of the world, basically. And this is one issue in Whispering Shadows, because this American family, the young son says we have to go to China, and the father says no, we have been in Wisconsin for 100 years, we don't have to. And the son takes his old father to Walmart, and I did that myself. I went to Walmart, and that's what the son Michael does with his father. And they pull things out of the shelves, and they couldn't find anything that wasn't made in China.
Yeah.
And that's how the older guy understands. Wow. Probably we have to move our production to China. So it's really, in China numbers are always mind-boggling. And you have 1.4 billion people, and maybe the middle and upper middle class, 100 million. This is a small percentage, but it's 100 million people. And of course, life is getting better for most of them. For some, it's wow, and for some, it's just a tiny little bit. But that is why it's still stable in China, because most people can expect to do better tomorrow, or next week, or next year. But this is starting to change, and there are many issues like environmental devastation, for instance. The economy is not growing that fast anymore, and things. So, and when they don't believe that they will be better off next year, then they start to ask questions.
It sounds to me like the Communist Party, is still in some way, shape, or form alive and well. So how does that articulate with this wealth disparity that you're describing?
As I said, because people expect to be better off next year. Maybe, your boss will be much, much better off, but even I will, maybe I can afford a fridge, or maybe I can afford a color TV, whatever. So even my living standard is improving. And the CP is very powerful. It's the best way to become rich, to be a party member of the CP because of the corruption. The best and brightest students in China, they don't want to be entrepreneurs, they want to be party members. Because that's the way to get rich and to have political power. And political power is even more important. And that's one thing that we really have a hard time to relate to. I interviewed in Chengdu, again, a very rich man, and he drove me around. He had, I think, 3 different big Mercedeses, and we had dinner together. And I looked at him and thought, you're so rich now and so powerful, but if the party wants, they can take everything away from you overnight. Is that correct? He looked at me and said, yes. There's no sense of security whatsoever. So that's why, even the brightest people, they want to be party members, because that's the best job you can have. You become rich and you are powerful. Tanya, you had a question?
Yeah. So you've written 2 of these books now. They're not very complimentary about the government.
No.
Do you worry about traveling there and any possible repercussions?
They're not complimentary about the government, but I hope it shines through that I really do like the Chinese people.
It does.
Because they have suffered so much, and there's so much grief in that country. They have been mistreated. It's really,
but I really wonder whether, do you feel any fear?
I still feel safe. I felt completely safe in the 90s, but things have changed. So when I go there now, I get my visa in Hong Kong only for 2 entries, no multiple entries anymore. And I feel like not so comfortable anymore, because it's easy to set you up. They just send a woman to your room in the hotel, and you open the door, and you don't even have to let her in. The police is there and say, "Oh, she's a prostitute." It's easy, and it has happened. It has happened. So, no, but nothing has happened to me. I get my visa, and I think they don't care. I'm a small potato, and unless this ends up on the New York Times bestseller list, maybe then pay attention.
Be back up.
Tomorrow evening, we're having our book club discussing the art of hearing heartbeats.
Oh.
But I asked her whether he wants to come.
Are you available?
Unfortunately, I'll be in Kansas.
Kansas. And my question is, what would you want to see if you were leading the book club discussion? What would be your overriding? I mean, obviously the love between the two
Yeah.
main characters. But what would you want to see being really discussed in depth?
Oh, that's a good
Reaction.
question.
Yeah, reaction to.
Yeah. I don't think I think in that terms. I tell a story that comes out of somewhere, you know, and whatever because you might get something else out of it than Tanya, or than you, or than you. I write the book for myself, basically.
And then what did you get out of it?
I think the pleasure of writing and I'm a romantic at heart. I really do believe that there is a force in life that is stronger than any human misery. And you know, you can call it love or whatever. I think there's a connection between two humans that can be so strong, stronger than the separation for 50 years, stronger than whatever. I believe that. So I try to maybe reinforce that belief. And I think it's, you know, nowadays you watch the news, whatever, you see so many terrible things. People do terrible things to each other out of hatred, whatever. So it's maybe sometimes it's wholesome to be reminded there's also a very positive force. And it's in all of us. I mean, it's not just...
Can I ask you one last
Yeah.
question on it? Why did it take the main character so long to get back to, what was her name again?
Mimi?
Yeah, Mimi, thanks.
I think for two reasons. First of all, they were together. They didn't have to be together physically. They had this kind of line of communication. They were together. They weren't separated on a certain level. You know, I had a friend, my very best friend, my soulmate, I would call him. He lived in America. We spent the childhood together, and then he moved to America, and unfortunately he died later. But we didn't talk for but we had this connection. I mean, I always felt we were like communicating. So I think Tim, Lin, and Mimi, they were communicating on a level. And then he left his wife, unfortunately, not
Right.
in a way she wanted or needed to be loved.
Right.
You know, that's her drama. He had responsibilities, his two children, and he left the day he could leave. Julia graduated, and he kind of sensed it was about time. And she sensed it was about, she waited. I don't want to spoil here. But, they both knew the day would come.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I heard you speak the last time you were here, and you said that Julia, right,
Mhm.
started talking to you, and that's what prompted you to
Mhm.
write the second book.
Mhm.
And we just heard Joseph Conrad speak about leaving Berlin, and he said his characters don't speak to you, he tells them exactly what to say. And after hearing what you had talked about, how would you respond to him saying that? Or
I
an
would say
author
there
who says
are
that?
as many different ways to write a book as
Okay.
there are writers.
Yeah.
And luckily, they do speak to me, yeah. And this theme I just read to you, this was
Yeah.
fantastic, because it was like watching a movie, and I just had to write down what the characters were saying. Unfortunately, writing is not always that easy. I would finish a book in 4 weeks.
We have one question. Our book club discussed your book last week, and we were wondering where Julia's brother went in America.
Yeah, you don't.
He went to San Francisco, and he's kind of neglected. He wasn't a major force in her life, or he didn't get along well with his father. He's not a major character. He's a little neglected.
We noticed.
Yeah.
I had a hard time reconciling the art of hearing heartbeats with what my experience was on the border of Burma at the same time you were there.
Mhm.
My daughter was working with the Marinols, and she was taking these terribly wounded and boys out of the jungle, getting them into Bangkok, getting them medical care. And she had such a bleak impression of Burma. How did you navigate that atmosphere when you were there? Because the military was terribly abusive and...
Oh yeah, and this is, have you read A Well-Tempered Heart?
Yes,
Yeah,
and
there
it comes
I-
out
absolutely.
exactly the side I had seen, and then I
Yeah.
see this beautiful, which I would love to think was really Burma without the military but it was such, there's not an inkling in the art.
Yeah, because I mean, I didn't write a non-fiction book, which, you know, I wanted to cover present-day Burma, whatever. And the way Julia experienced Burma was the way I experienced it. It was really, I had so many magical moments, and even in the 90s I was visiting it, you didn't see the military much. It's really how I encountered it, and then the rest is set in the 30s anyhow. So, but of course I was aware, and I did research, I wrote stories for Stern, so that's why it's an important part in book 2. And there will be a third book, because I would like to know how the story continues with Julia. So it will be even more present in the third book.
Very good. So you weren't really restricted in moving around the country?
Yes, you are. In Burma, you are. Even in the, especially in the 90s, there were lots of areas that were just off limit because there was a civil war going on. Yes.
But this village you went to, that wasn't...
That was in the Shan states. There was no war, nothing. It was really the way I describe it. That's how I experienced it.
This book is so different than the other 2 books. When was this written? Was it written?
In 2000, came out in Germany actually in 2007.
And where does that fall in terms of the other Well-Tempered Heart and the Party?
First, The Uttering Heartbeats, then I wrote Whispering Shadows, and then Dragon Games. And then I wanted to write the third part of the China series, but that's when I met Julia, and I couldn't let go. I really met her in Burma, basically, and she started talking, and I got so curious that I started writing to see what happened to her 10 years afterwards. So, and I thought maybe this is just a short story, or maybe I have to throw it away in the end. But she kept talking, and I just wrote it down, and it turned out to be a novel. Yes.
Did you use the same translator for these books?
No,
This book?
because he was busy translating A Well-Tempered Heart when
okay.
Simon & Schuster picked this up, and they wanted to get the translation as fast as possible. So we found somebody else. I think she also did a good job. Certain points where I think, but all in all, I think she did a very good job. She's ethnic Chinese. She lives in London and was married to a German guy, lived in Germany for 10 years. So I'm happy.
I'm very curious to read it. I'm from Germany too, so I'm from Munich. So I'm very curious to read it in German because the English version is beautiful.
For the
heart, yeah.
Ah, yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
great for
Check out if I can write that well. One last little funny story. I love Chinese proverbs, Chinese wisdom, and they every time I interview somebody, eventually they come up with some Chinese proverbs, and many of them are in the book. You know, Chang, the detective, he loves Chinese proverbs, and sometimes he has this proverb competition. He only communicates in proverbs with his boss. And I have 7 books with Chinese proverbs at home. Because they have this way of putting wisdom into 1-2 sentences. It's fantastic. So when I talk to Chinese, they always tell me proverbs, but then they say, are there any German proverbs? And I'm not good with German proverbs, so I only know a few. But eventually, I start making things up. So if you ever meet a Chinese who says he knows a German proverb that says, when the door is shut, the deer dies, you know he talked to me. There's one wonderful Chinese proverb which I love to quote. Be kind to unkind people. They need it the most.
Thank you so much.